moment now to thank our heritage partners, in particular the Battle of Homestead Foundation, who I'll thank tonight again. But their brochures are on the table. They've been really great in promoting some of our programs, and some of them have come down. So yeah, thank you, Battle of Homestead Foundation. Now, they have a tie to Wheeling, as you know. We are standing in a county library, not Carnegie Library, because the events at Homestead in 1892 motivated organized labor here in Wheeling to prevent that Carnegie Library from happening. So, in solidarity. I also want to thank WVU Press, publisher of the book you're about to hear about, another of our partners. In 1986, Lon Savage published Thunder in the Mountains, the West Virginia Mine War, 1920-21, a popular history now considered a classic. Among those influenced by the book, Denise Giardina, author of Storming Heaven, and John Sayles, who directed Matewan, the film. When Savage passed away, he left behind an incomplete book manuscript by a lesser-known Mother Jones crusade in Kanawha County, West Virginia. I know better. His daughter, Ginny Savage Ayers, drew on his notes and files, as well as her own original research to complete the book, Never Justice, Never Peace, Mother Jones and the Minor Rebellion at Paint and Cabin Creeks. This is the first book-length account of those incidents of that strike. Ginny Savage Ayers is the daughter of Lon Savage, and she's worked for many years in scientific research and teaching. Currently, she resides in Tennessee, where she is involved in environmental and social causes. Please welcome Ginny Savage Ayers.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you for coming to this. I really appreciate it. I thought I would start, just tell you a little bit about myself. As Sean said, I lived in Tennessee near Knoxville. Ended up there via Colorado. Grew up in Virginia. My family lived in Blacksburg, Virginia, where as a teenager I was aware of my dad writing Thunder in the Mountains, and I was always kind of intrigued by that whole process. And then, as he was doing the research for Thunder in the Mountains, he learned about this other person, Mother Jones, and he was fascinated by her. And I remember hearing, he would tell us stories about this, what seemed to me almost a mythical woman, and some of the stories that he told about her were, I thought he was exaggerating, actually, but he wasn't. And he decided that he wanted to write a book about her and her involvement in the Paint Creek, Cabin Creek mine war. So he died in 2004, and at that point he had not been working on the book for a while, and I wasn't sure whether it was because it wasn't, it wasn't there. The material just wasn't there. It wasn't a story. But I did mention to him, he had terminal illness, and before he died, I mentioned to him that I might think about working and finishing the book, and he sort of kind of went, And that was about it. But I took that as permission and a blessing, and it was a few years later that I actually started to work on it. I collected all of his material. He had done a tremendous amount of research, and I brought all of his research back to my home in Tennessee, and also took advantage of the internet that he didn't have to take advantage of, but he was doing his research. So I was able to do some more in addition to what he had done. In addition, and that also helped me to contact some descendants of some of the miners that really, I think, added an extra touch to the story. So, if you're not familiar with the geography of that area, that blue line is the Kanawha River. There's Charleston up to the top there, and Paint Creek and Cabin Creek are two parallel creeks that run north, and they both empty into the Kanawha River. And all of those towns are coal camps, basically, most of them, that were involved in this struggle. Some of them don't exist anymore. Several of them still exist, but they have had their names changed. But there is a lot of history in those valleys. This is just a picture of this is a Paint Creek mine. Paint Creek miners heading into the mines. As you can see, the conditions were pretty rough. And then this is a picture of one of the coal camps. These are Jenny Lind style cabins that they lived in. This was on Cabin Creek. You can see on the lower left side there's a water pump. And that was the community water supply for the coal camp. And these cabins were owned by the coal company. Miners, even if they had the means to buy a house, were not permitted to purchase the house. They were charged rent that was taken out of their paycheck. Their lives were very much under the control, under the thumb of the coal companies. And this is another picture of, this is Burnwell, which was one of the towns on that map. On this one, I think you can see there's the company store there on the left. This is another company store. This is the Holly and Stevenson company store at Eskdale on Cabin Creek. Eskdale still exists as a community. It's not much of a community, but the name is still there. And in this company store, the post office is located on the left side of the store. These company stores usually contain the post office, usually it was also the train station and ticket agency. And basically, carried anything that the miners and their families would need. So they did all their shopping at the company store, usually at elevated prices because that was the only place they could buy their items. The miners were usually paid in scrip, which was basically fake money, which was only good at the company store. So again, that's just more evidence of the kind of control that the company had over the miners, and it just didn't sit well with the miners. They were becoming more and more unhappy with the way their lives were going. This is the interior of a company store. This one, the older woman there is Ma Blizzard, if you've heard of her. She was, I guess, Bill Blizzard's mom, is that right? And Bill Blizzard was involved in the 1920-21 and Battle of Blair Mountain. But that was a family store. So this was an example of, I might have misspoke. This was actually a privately owned store, and there were a few of them. Eskdale was sort of one of the more miner-friendly towns and was an independent town. This is another company store. This one is at Mucklow, which is on Paint Creek. And you can see the miners kind of hanging out on the steps, which was something they like to do in their free time. When they weren't working, they would just kind of hang out and gossip, kind of chew the fat. But after they went on strike, and the strike happened about in April of 1912. They'd been trying to negotiate with the company, the coal companies, and the mine owners, and they weren't able to come to an agreement. The union was trying to negotiate a contract, and the miners wanted, pay was one of the items that they wanted, but they were even willing to give up that and stick with their current pay if they could just get union recognition throughout southern West Virginia. The mine owners would not agree to that for anything. That was the last thing they wanted, was to allow the union to spread throughout West Virginia. So when they went on strike, the mine owners brought in mine guards. These were guards that worked for the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency out of Bluefield. The the Baldwins were actually from Roanoke, Virginia. The Felts lived around Bluefield. And so the Felts family were mostly involved with this part, this conflict. And once Mother Jones heard about what was happening in West Virginia, she was actually in Montana when she read the paper, and she heard that the miners in West Virginia had gone on strike. She had been in West Virginia before. She was a union organizer that actually went all over the country. But she really liked West Virginia, and especially the West Virginia miners. That was sort of her pet project. So when she heard she was out there doing some other labor organizing, she read in the paper what was happening in West Virginia, and she got on the train, came across country, came to Charleston, checked in at a hotel, and that same day got back on the local train and went to Paint Creek. And from then on, that was early June, I guess, of 1912. And from that point on, then things really started to heat up. This is a picture of her talking to a crowd at Montgomery, which is on the Kanawha. And people are really attentive. And I like this photo. It shows people that are, fairly well dressed. There's these ladies with fancy hats, and they are listening attentively. So it's obvious that it wasn't just the miners, but a lot of people knew about her. A lot of people had heard about her. The miners knew her very well and were thrilled when she came. They thought, now we have somebody who's on our side that has a little power, and she's going to help us. This is an iconic photo, well-known photo of Mother Jones. This was actually first published on the cover of the International Socialist Review in 1913. And it's a picture of her helping this mother with her two children, putting on their shoes, and they're living in a tent. This is after they have been evicted. Because when the miners went on strike, the coal company owners would say, well, if you're not going to work, then you can't live in our company-owned houses. And the miners said, okay, we're out of here. And they would, the union sent in tents, and they set up tent colonies. This was going on heavily throughout the summer of 1912. So whole families with babies up to, teenagers, pregnant mothers, lived in these tents for basically about a year, and then including the long, cold West Virginia winter. So these were some determined people, for sure. This is a shot of some of the Baldwin-Felts guards. These are guards that are milling around at I think it's the Cabin Creek Junction. And they would kind of just mill around, keep an eye on people, question people as to what their business was, especially if they looked like they might be a union organizer, because those people were just not allowed in the area. And this is another picture of some mine guards. This, I hope you can see it very well, but on the tripod is a machine gun. And machine guns were brought in to fire on the miners, or fire on the mountains where the miners were hiding, in response to the violence that had already started. And there was shooting from both sides, and there were killings on both sides. The mine guard that's standing just to the right of that machine gun, a man with a hat and a white shirt and jacket, that is Ernest Gaugeot, who was a notorious mine guard, one of the most hated. And there were several interesting stories about him. He caused some problems, let's just say. This man is Tom Phelps. So he was the the general manager. He was the vice president, I think, of the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency, and he was the general manager in that area. He had two sons that also worked for him, Al and Lee Phelps. And so he would, kind of parade around in his nice car, make the miners resentful. This is a nice kind of typical picture of what the miners' families' living conditions was like. This is they were kicked out of their cabins and they basically had to take all of their stuff with them. So you can see there's like a rocking chair on the left and some little pieces of furniture. She's got laundry hanging, and this is what they dealt with. This is how they lived throughout that whole strike period. And then as things got tense, even the women were not to be trifled with. You can see this woman has a rifle. And the women were known to cause some trouble. They would, when train pulls of scabs, or what they call transportations, replacement workers or strike breakers, as they're called, they would bring them in by the trainload, and the women were known to go and hang out at the train station when those trains came in and yell and catcall at them, throw rocks at them, maybe even use their guns on them. I don't know, but there were shots fired at these trains, probably from the miners hiding up on the hills. And here's, this is a group of, let's say, I think these are Cabin Creek miners getting ready for battle. When they started bringing in the strike breakers, which really kind of picked up going into October, November, that was kind of interesting because they would send out these people, these recruiters, to go out to, Ellis Island, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Chicago, all these cities where immigrants were known to be coming in, and they would tell these immigrants, oh, we've got these great jobs for you, great pay, wonderful conditions, we're hiring. And they'd go, oh, okay, and they'd get on the train and head south, and then the people the officials on the train would lock the doors so they couldn't get off the train. Like when they pulled into a station, they couldn't get off. And they brought the train down, all the way down into the Kanawha Valley region. And that's when a lot of them first learned that they were actually strikebreakers. These workers, these immigrants, didn't know that they were being brought down to take the place of striking miners. They didn't even know they were getting mine jobs. They thought they were getting jobs, as boilermakers or other laborers. And a lot of them at that point tried to leave, and they weren't allowed to leave because, first of all, they said, well, first you got to pay back your train fare, and it took about a month of work before they could pay that off. And so that just sort of intensified the anger. Now, not just from the miners, but also from these transportations, strikebreakers who were brought in. And then in response to the fighting, the violence, the gunfire that was coming from the miners, they were firing down from the mountainsides. And as I mentioned, the mine guards said, we need machine guns. So they brought in machine guns, and then they built these concrete bunkers. And they would hide out in these bunkers and shoot through those slots with the machine guns. Now, as things were getting pretty tense by the late summer of 1912, and the governor at the time was William Glasscock, and things really came to a head after one particular incident resulting in some deaths. And at that point, then he finally decided to declare martial law, and he brought in several companies of militia. This was soldiers in the West Virginia National Guard. There were a total of, I believe, 6 companies in the National Guard, and at one point during that fall, all 6 of those companies were in that region, trying to quell the unrest. And they basically took the place of the mine guards, which, to some extent, the miners welcomed that because they hated the mine guards, and they were being treated fairly well by the soldiers. You know, the soldiers would actually kind of help clean up things and maintain some civility. I mean, the miners didn't, you know, want to be causing problems and shooting. They wanted their problems solved. But eventually, you know, things soured again because even the militia were helping to evict families. When they declared martial law, when martial law was declared, one of the results of that was that nobody was allowed to have a gun on either side. And so the militia went through and collected up everybody's guns. And just to make a statement, they took them all to Charleston and set up displays like this, showing hundreds of guns and all the ammunition that they had collected from this martial law. So this was on the lawn of the Capitol, probably around September of 1912. And then they also started arresting people who were breaking the laws of martial law, and the courts were supplanted by this military commission. And so this is basically what's been referred to as the Supreme Court of the West Virginia Military Commission. And they are the ones that would sort of dispense of these trials very quickly, just boom, 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 and, make a decision, send people to jail. They had a lot of power. Now this is a picture of the tent colony of Holly Grove. Holly Grove was on Paint Creek, not too far from the mouth of the creek, and an incident happened there in February of 1913 that really kind of was a flashpoint. When I was talking about the transportations being brought in, because of the shooting that was going on at the trains, the train people or the guards decided that they needed protection, and so the train company, the C&O, Chesapeake and Ohio, armored a train car, for the purpose of protection. And that train car, there were actually a couple of them, and it was called the Bull Moose Special, and it was for the purpose of carrying transportations or the mine guards or whoever up into the valleys of Paint Creek and Cabin Creek, and it was armored to protect them against gunfire. Now, one night in February of 1913, this Bull Moose Special went up with carrying some militia and some coal company. Actually, it was coal company people and sheriffs and sheriff deputies mostly. And they went up around midnight one night because there had been, again, some unrest. A gunfight, or a gunfight basically broke out. And of course, both sides say the other side started. But it was a pretty shocking event. It was surprising that there was only one death. One striking miner named Sesko Estep was killed. He was actually trying to get his family under cover. He had a cabin, and they had built he was building a basement underneath, and he was trying to shelter and get his wife and his kids down under the house, and he was hit in the head with a bullet and died instantly. So this really, really infuriated the miners, and sort of, I'd say, was a flashpoint. And there were running battles over the next several days in response to this. And then, following that, martial law was declared again. This was actually the third instance of martial law. It was declared in September, and again in November, each time about a month or so at a time. And then it was declared again in February, again by Governor Glasscock. But this was about the end of Governor Glasscock's term, and he was replaced in March by Governor Henry Hatfield. So Henry Hatfield came into office sort of inheriting this labor problem, and martial law was still in effect at that point. And so that's kind of where things stood when he came into office. This is just, I think, a fascinating document. It's a hand-drawn map that was drawn in, I think it was about 1975, by a man, and fairly elderly man, who was a child, living in Holly Grove, and was there the night of the Bull Moose shooting. And he did this all from memory, and it's annotated with not just the Bull Moose shooting events, but several events. Down in the bottom right corner it says, "This is where Mother Jones would come with a band about every Sunday and speak under the trees." So he wrote all these little notes. This is just a blow-up of one part of it. He has arrows pointing to where people lived and where shootings occurred. It's interesting to me that there was another shooting that happened in the summer of 1912 where a mine guard was killed. That mine guard was named Stringer, and Stringer and another mine guard named William Fopp, were on this bicycle rail car, and they came through Holly Grove, and the miners were waiting for him, and the miners just opened fire and shot them. Killed Stringer immediately. Fopp was seriously injured, but he survived. But the rumor was that it wasn't Fopp. They thought it was actually Gaugeot, that notorious mine guard that everybody hated. And I think that they may have actually, were hoping that it was Gaugeot. And it's interesting that in 1975, I don't know if you can see, right there in the middle where it says, where Stringer was killed and Gaugeot, which is the phonetic spelling, it's actually a French name, G-A-U-J-O-T, I believe, but sounds like Gaugeot, was wounded and died later. So even then, he still had the impression that Gaugeot was killed during that incident, that shooting. So this is really, I think, a priceless artifact and record of history. After the Bull Moose shooting and then the battles that followed that, and martial law was declared, again there was a big rounding up of prisoners. The militia went through and just arrested people right and left. Usually they would find miners with guns up in the hills, and they would just round them up and send them to Charleston, or actually usually it was in Pratt that they were jailed in what was called the bullpen. And there were over 100 people that were men that were arrested and held in these, basically had to kind of cram them into stores and places anywhere they could put to hold them. But also, Mother Jones had gone to Charleston with a group of miners because they wanted to talk to the governor. They had met, they had planned this, what they were going to say. They got on the train and they headed for Charleston, and rumor went around that Mother Jones and these miners were coming to shoot the governor and just, cause havoc. That was absolutely not the case, but that's what the word was. So they got to Charleston, they got off the train. Mother Jones was walking down the street in Charleston, and she was arrested. And she was taken from Charleston back to the martial law zone. So because she was arrested under martial law, but not in the martial law zone. So she had to be taken back to the martial law zone. And this is a picture of her prison. So she stayed in a house with a family, a husband and wife who were actually sympathetic to the miners' cause. But this is where she was held as a prisoner for about 3 months, almost 3 months. This is the man on the right is a major in the militia. The woman standing behind her with the hat is, her name is Cora Older. She was a reporter who came from California to report on these events going on in West Virginia. So as I mentioned, Governor Hatfield, Henry Hatfield became governor. And he was, now it was up to him to kind of solve this problem. And he's actually the nephew of Devil Anse Hatfield. He liked the miners. He wasn't, anti-miner, but he didn't always make the best decisions. And he worked on trying to get the miners and the union people and the coal company people to come together and reach an agreement, and it was extremely difficult. And for one thing, the union leaders and the rank and file miners often didn't see eye to eye. It was thought that the union leaders were sort of selling out. The rank and file wanted them to stick to the demands that they had, which mostly boiled down to they wanted to be able to have a union. They wanted their union to be recognized and be allowed to meet as a union. And that was, as I said before, that was something that the mine owners would not give on. So it got just very difficult. I think that's probably why Hatfield kept Mother Jones in prison all that time. Not because she really, there were charges against her, but basically the reason was he needed her to be out of the way so he could get a handle on the strike and try to bring a resolution. And he thought that doing that would help with settling things down. Of course, Mother Jones, she could raise hell from anywhere, including prison. And she did, and she wrote letters, and she had ways of communicating that were amazing. And she could get messages out through people who were, even one of her guards would kind of help her out, take messages and sneak them out. And the woman, the wife of the family that she was living with, also would take messages to a post office in a different town. Let's see. And eventually, the negotiations kind of went back and forth. Hatfield was just losing his cool. He had it. He was tired of the negative response from both sides. And eventually he said, okay, you miners, you just got to go back to work. We've got this agreement here. It's pretty close to what you want. You either go along with it and you go back to work, or you have to get out of here. You have to leave. And eventually that's what happened. They did go back to work. Again, there was sort of some back and forth, violence and another little mini strike, but it was more or less resolved, although it really wasn't resolved because it didn't deal with the issues that the miners wanted to have dealt with. But there were investigations that were conducted. There was a U.S. congressional investigation that took place during the summer of 1913 and into the fall, and that's been a huge source of resource material. You can find it online. You can download PDF form versions of the testimony. This is almost 3,000 pages of testimony in these Senate congressional investigations. And that's been just a wonderful source of information. There was also an investigation done by the Socialist Party of America. This photo here was taken when this committee of socialists, and the man in the middle holding the child is Eugene Debs, and let's see, the one on the left is Germer, who's a socialist, and he's the sort of bald man, and I believe the man second from the right is another socialist. Yeah, that's Germer, and then the first guy is Berger. And this is, they're standing with a family. This man is kind of behind Debs with the black hat. That's Lawrence Dwyer, peg-leg Dwyer. He, like many miners of the day, had lost his leg in a mine collapse. And his wife Lillian is standing just sort of behind him. And those are all of their children. And one of Lillian and Lawrence Dwyer's descendants I was able to get a hold of through Ancestry.com and Facebook and so forth, and was able to track her down, and she provided this photo, although this photo has also been published and is available. But she gave me some family history, some documentation of family history that her ancestors had written, and so that provided some really good information. This is actually what was used for the the cover of the book, and I put this up there because this was published in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle not long after Mother Jones was released from prison. So Brooklyn, New York. I believe, as far as I know, that's the first time this photo appeared anywhere. But this photo was taken, and I figured this out based on what these signs said. This photo was taken the previous summer, probably in August of 1912, during a march in Charleston. And the Charleston Gazette had reported on this march and actually had written in their newspaper coverage the text of the signs that the miners were carrying. And this is exactly these signs about Negro fiddle while Rome burned and no Russia for us and so forth. Those were all published in the Gazette in August of 1912. And then but there was no photo. Oops. So that I know of, I believe this was the first time it was published. The interesting thing about this is, in the Gazette article, it listed, the text of all these signs, and one of those signs said, "Death to the thugs who cut off the breast of a woman at Cayford." And that was one of these just wild rumors that went around. Who knows how it started, but there was an investigation conducted to see if that actually happened, and it was determined that never actually happened. But that's the sign that's sort of in the back there. You can make out some of the words: thug, breast, and Cayford. And so, that's how I kind of put together that this is a picture of that march that the Gazette wrote about that didn't have a photo of. And I thought I would close with this photograph, which this is sort of, I guess, in honor of all West Virginians who are still struggling with worker rights. And this is actually a picture of, most of these men work for the Huntington Socialist and Labor Star, a socialist newspaper at the time in Huntington, which was shut down by Governor Hatfield. While Mother Jones was in prison, and a lot of the others were other men were still in prison. They were, undergoing all these so-called trials. Hatfield thought that it would help his cause if he could kind of stifle the socialists and labor press. He thought, let's just kind of quiet their voice, and then we can just slip all this through. Like I said, he didn't always make good decisions. That was not one of his more shining moments. But I like this picture because of what it says in the picture, in the signs. First of all, this man holding an X, that's to denote a man named Taylor, who was one of the men that was shot in one of the battles following the Bull Moose shooting. He actually survived, he didn't die. But this sort of adds a little extra drama to say, this is our comrade Taylor, represented by this X. Some of these signs say, let's see, that top one, mountaineers are always free, not in West Virginia. And then one says, men, our mother is in the bullpen. And then, let's see, I can't see that, free speech. Yeah, free speech and free press, regardless of Hatfield. So, I just thought that was sort of an appropriate slide to end with, and hope that we can, workers today can make progress in getting their voices heard and having their issues resolved. And I will take any questions.
I saw the PBS 9 Wars documentary, and they portrayed Mother Jones as very instrumental in the strike and the years after that. So what is your
She, I think the question was about Mother Jones' role in the strike and following events. Of course, the strike started before she got there, although she did come earlier. She was in West Virginia in 1902 and helped to organize the union. That lasted a year or two, and then that kind of fizzled because the mine owners reneged on the contract. They wouldn't honor the contract anymore. So, and then they kicked out the union. So that didn't last. And then when things started up again in 1912, and she came back, the miners were obviously upset and angry and wanted change. And she sort of, fed on that and played on that and also told them, she would tell them why they have the right to demand these rights. And said, these people, these owners are taking advantage of you, and you shouldn't let them do that. And so surely she managed to stir things up, and she probably elevated the level of violence because of her words. And that was the big thing that the governor didn't like and the mine owners didn't like. They said that she was responsible for the violence. Well, she had a role in it, but it would have been, I think, violent. There would have been violence even if she hadn't been there. I mean, there already was before she got there. There were shootings. Does that answer the question? Yeah.
Tell us a little about her personal life. I know she was married. Did she have children?
Yeah. She had a very interesting sort of former history, or early life history. She was born in Cork, Ireland, in 1838. So she, as a child, was living in Cork during the famine. Her father moved the family to North America. I think they were in Canada for a while, and then she ended up in Chicago as a young woman. She was, even then, a very independent and strong woman. She worked as a school teacher, and she worked as a seamstress, and then at one point she moved down to Memphis. She was still single at that time. But in Memphis, she met and married George Jones, who was an iron holder, also a union man. Before she was married, her name was Mary Harris. So Mary Harris Jones was her full name. But in Memphis, she and her husband George had 4 children. And then in 1867, there was a yellow fever epidemic, and within 1 week, she lost her husband and all 4 children. She watched them die one by one as she tried to nurse them and lost them all. And people were dying all around the city, and of course it was mostly the poor people who were dying because the richer people could pack up and leave. The poor people had nowhere to go and no means to go anywhere. So that was, obviously a horribly tragic event in her life, and I'm sure very, shaped the person that she became. She, at some point, not long after that, she moved back to Chicago. And she has written, she wrote an autobiography, the autobiography of Mother Jones, and it's an interesting read. Not always factually accurate, but very telling, very good insight into the persona of Mother Jones. And so you don't really get a big sense of what her life was like during these times. I mean, she dealt with it very briefly in her book. She moved back to Chicago. She started up a business as a seamstress. She then would work for wealthy people, making their dresses and their curtains and so forth, and observe the contrast between the lives of these wealthy people and the lives of the laboring class that she was a part of. And the bitterness just really grew. And then, 1871, the Great Chicago Fire happened, and she lost her business and all her possessions and just everything. She had nothing at that point. So this was, again, another horrible tragedy in her life that would, just do most people in. Again, she was able to pick herself up and rise from the ashes, so to speak. And within a few years, she started going to labor meetings and rallies, and she started getting to know some of the big people. And just over the years, over time, she became more and more active. She started speaking at these events, which is pretty unusual to see a woman, a middle-aged woman, speaking at these events. She made friends with people like Eugene Debs. She was involved in had a role in the formation of the IWW, and then the UMWA formed in 1890, and her role just continued to pick up.
Chronologically, where does Blair Mountain comes in later?
Right.
After the Ayers?
Yeah, and I guess I should have mentioned that. So the Cabin Creek, Pay Creek strike sort of got tied up in 1913, but as I said, things really weren't at a good
And where's Matewan?
point.
It's not
Matewan, the shooting in Matewan happened in 1920.
20?
So, yeah. So during the teens, the Union was, leaders were emerging, like Frank Keeney and Fred Mooney, who were from Payne Cabin Creek. And then, and it was basically the same sort of issues in Matewan and Logan County and Mingo County that were, causing unrest with the miners. So the Matewan shooting, which is what Thunder in the Mountain starts with, is Matewan shooting. It's a shootout between mine guards and miners and their supporters. And that, again, led to another year-long strike and culminated in the Battle of Clear Mountain in 1921. So May of 1920 was Matewan. September of 21 was Clear Mountain.
Yeah, you mentioned that she and the miners went to meet with the governor of Charleston. She wasn't arrested there. She was taken back to the martial law zone.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to assume that the whole county was not under martial law.
No.
It was just the places where the miners were on strike.
Right. It was just the Cabin Creek, and then there was a defined boundary of the martial law zone. Charleston was not in that. But she was arrested by militia and taken by car to the train station, put on the train, taken back to Pratt on Kanawha, and put in, ended up in that house that she stayed in for about 3 months. So yeah, I mean, martial law basically meant they could do whatever they wanted. There was no, the Constitution was not in effect, basically.
So how long was she in West Virginia? She went in 1912. She presumably gave these rallies on Sundays.
Yeah.
Or was in there for 3 months under house arrest. Then sort of, where did it go from there?
Well, generally, she was mostly in West Virginia from like June of 1912 through middle of the summer, July, I think, of 1913. But not entire, I mean, she would make trips, she made several trips where she would go speak in New York City, at Carnegie Hall, or Pittsburgh, or I think, she came to Wheeling, spoke there. You know, a lot of these centers where there were labor organizations and unions, and she would speak and basically drill up support and get people to contribute, get unions from all over the country to send money in to District 17, the local UMWA union, you know, to help them purchase tents and support the miners. But then after she was released from prison, you know, when the governor kind of scolded her and said, "Don't do this again," and she's like, "Sure." And by fall, I think around September, she went off to, she would go to, is it not Montana, Ohio. She had other causes to attend to. She went to Colorado and was involved in that strike there that ended with the Logo massacre. She wasn't there during the massacre, I don't think, but she was involved in those strikes. She was involved in Colorado several times. So she had missions all over the country.
Right, by 1920, when this Blair Mountain thing was boiling over, was she involved in that, or?
She had a small role in that. Her mostly is known for her advice to the local union leaders when the Blair Mountain March was getting underway, and she basically said that she had a telegram from the president, you know, saying, "You better call off this march." And she really didn't have a telegram, but she, you know, I guess she was trying to kind of quell the unrest again. She was, you know, it was a very controversial thing that she did that people still kind of debate what was her reasoning, but that's mainly what she was known for in that event, series of events. Yeah.
Where did she get her finances since she lost everything?
Right. She was paid by UMWA. They would pay her room and board and actually a fairly decent salary, you know, by those standards. And that's how she lived. She didn't have a home. People would ask her where she lived, and she said, I live wherever the strike is, or something like that. Wherever she's needed, that's where she goes. She was basically a homeless person. And she would stay with her friends, stay with the people, the laborers that she was working for. You know, they'd love to host her and have her stay in their home. But, you know, she managed to support herself fairly well.
How old was she in these pictures that you have?
She was, let's see, she was born in 1838. She was in her upper 70s, although she was mid-70s, because she claimed to be 80 years old. She probably had no idea what her birthday or birth year was, and it was only fairly recent research that found a baptismal record that people pretty much accept that she was born in 1838. But she said she was 80 years old when this was going on. Probably wasn't true, but, you know, it really didn't matter. She had the right to say whatever she wanted. Yeah.
Did management of these companies ever just think, why don't we just give the miners what they want? And save all of this? This is a real disaster.
Yeah.
Productivity-wise,
Right.
human relations. Why didn't they just give the miners what they wanted?
You know, the union,
Save all that.
you know, all the mines, sort of the northern mines, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, they were all unionized. The union was successful in coming all through there. West Virginia was kind of a little bit behind the curve in terms of developing their coal industry because of transportation. You know, the trains, it took a while before the tracks got put in. But when once coal started, the industry picked up in West Virginia, it was very successful. And part of that was because they didn't have a union, and so they could sort of outcompete those areas that did have a union. Which of course, you know, even the coal operators in those northern states wanted West Virginia to have a union so that they could compete on equal ground. But that was just absolutely unacceptable. That was the mine owners and operators in West Virginia said, you know, they claimed that they were barely getting by as it was, and they said if we let the union in, you know, well, we can't survive. Yeah. So.
It's kind of a class equal rights attitude that
Well, yeah.
the people are down here and the owners are up here.
Yeah.
And we didn't have equal rights for people in those days.
Yeah, you know, and there's this attitude that, well, we can just silence the press, and they won't know, they won't learn anything, you know, they'll never figure it out. You know.
So once we come in, finally recognized by the minors.
Yeah, well, you know, it's sort of like piecemeal, but the union was struggling all through the teen years, the 19 teens in West Virginia. And there were certain coal companies that would recognize the union and allow their employees to join a union. And but it wasn't, you know. And there were new chapters that were coming into existence. But it really wasn't doing well. And then when the 1920-21 mine war happened, that really set back the union. That was really a big loss for the miners. And really throughout the rest of the 20s, the union was not doing well. It was pretty weak. But I think, you know, after the Depression or during the 30s, the union started to gain some strength and come into existence more.
Could you tell us a little bit about Mother Jones Ann, how she died and where she's buried?
She's buried in Mount Olive, Illinois. It's actually the Union Miners Cemetery, and she said that during, you know, decades earlier, or probably more than once, she said it would be an honor for me to be buried in the Union Miners Cemetery of Mount Olive. She died when she was living in a home in Maryland. And actually, because she really didn't know how old she was, she really said she was about 7 years older than she really was. She claimed to be 100 years old, and that's what everybody understood, that she was 100 years old. And they had a birthday party at this home in Maryland, her 100th birthday party, and there's actually a video clip of her talking. And she's very feeble at this point. You can find it on, there's a Mother Jones Museum. I think if you just Google Mother Jones Museum, and that's in Illinois, they have a website, and you can find that video clip of her. And she's still, you know, she's feeble, but she's still got that fire, and she's still got that passion. So she died in, I think it was like November of 1930, November, December. And it was a huge event. I mean, she was really well known. And it's just amazing how little known she is today compared to how well known she was then. People, you know, dignitaries, famous people came to her funeral. She was put on a train, her body was put on a train with bunting and, you know, taken back to Mount Olive. And it was quite the event.
They got that magazine now named after her.
Yeah, it is. The Mother Jones magazine is basically, you know, because of, you know, her philosophy of social activism. That's where that name came from. Well, I guess that's about all we have time for.